Moscow winter 1970 killed over 3,000 people. Not from the cold, from the heating system. Soviet buildings were so overheated that people had to sleep with windows open in -30 degrees Celsius weather. This is the story of a hidden catastrophe, a forensic reconstruction of an epidemiological and infrastructural disaster that official Soviet history barely acknowledges. It starts with the sound. In January 1970, the air in Moscow became so dense with cold that it carried sound with an eerie, supernatural clarity. If you were standing on Kalinin Prospekt, you could hear the crunch of leather boots on dry snow from 3 blocks away. You could hear the screech of tram wheels grinding against frozen steel tracks as if they were right next to your ear. But you wouldn't see much. At -30 degrees Celsius, the moisture in every exhaled breath freezes instantly. It creates a cloud of ice crystals known as human fog.
Walk down the street, and you are walking through a mist of your own making. The typically bustling sidewalks are empty. The city is hunkered down. The only movement comes from the heavy diesel trucks and buses, their engines left running 24 hours a day. They have to. If a driver turns off the ignition for even 20 minutes, the fuel turns into a useless gel, and the engine becomes a solid block of iron. The smell of unburnt diesel exhaust hangs heavy and low in the stagnant air, trapped by a thermal inversion layer that acts like a lid on the city. This was not just a cold snap, it was a siege. Meteorological archives from the Amderma and Moscow stations confirm that January 1970 was a statistical outlier, a freak event that pushed the engineered environment of the Soviet Union to its absolute breaking point. Usually, winds from the Atlantic bring milder air and snow to the capital, keeping temperatures manageable, somewhere between -6 degrees Celsius and -10 degrees Celsius. But in late December 1969, something went wrong in the atmosphere. A massive Siberian anticyclone formed over the central Russian upland. It was a high-pressure ridge that locked the city in place, blocking the westerly winds. The skies cleared, the wind died, and the temperature plunged. By the first week of January, the thermometer had fallen past the -25 degrees Celsius threshold and kept going. It hit -27 degrees Celsius, then lower. This wasn't a momentary dip in the graph. It was a sustained flatline of extreme cold that lasted for weeks. The ground itself froze to a depth of 1.5 meters. Imagine the sheer physical stress on the city. The soil expanding and contracting, putting immense shear stress on the subterranean infrastructure buried within the frost line. The entire metropolis was being squeezed by the earth itself. And yet, despite this Arctic exterior, the true danger wasn't freezing to death on the street. The true danger was brewing indoors. The Soviet response to this external threat was a brute force application of thermal energy. The Mosenergo system, the state-run energy monopoly, operated under a simple, terrified philosophy: heat is life. As the temperature outside dropped to historic lows, they began to pump calories into the city at a rate that would turn the sanctuary of the home into a desiccant chamber. To understand why this happened, you have to look at the machine itself. The Mosenergo district heating network wasn't just a utility, it was the largest centralized heating system in the world. It was a crowning achievement of Soviet industrial planning, born from the Stalinist drive for self-sufficiency. The economic logic was impeccably Marxist-Leninist. They believed it was wasteful for every building to have its own boiler. That was inefficient, that was individualistic. Instead, they built massive combined heat and power plants, CHPs. These industrial cathedrals burned natural gas or mazout fuel oil to generate electricity, and then took the waste steam from the turbines to heat water for the entire city. By 1970, plants like CHP-12 on Berezhkovskaya embankment and the massive CHP-21 in the north were the beating heart of Moscow. They operated immense T-250 turbines, supercritical units designed to extract every possible joule of heat. It was an engineering marvel. It connected the citizen directly to the state via a hot water pipe. But in January 1970, that connection became a threat. The system had a critical flaw. It was an open loop in terms of control. The power plant pumped heat based on a schedule and a rigid graph, not based on the specific temperature inside apartment 612. There were no thermostats on the radiators. There were no valves for the residents to adjust. The state determined the temperature, and you lived in it. The fatal technical flaw lay in a method called qualitative regulation. In the Mosenergo system, the speed of the water moving through the pipes was kept constant. To change the heat output, engineers only changed the temperature of the water. The protocol was a strict mathematical relationship. If the outside air is -5 degrees Celsius, supply water is 70 degrees Celsius. If outside air is -15 degrees Celsius, supply water is 95 degrees Celsius. But when the air hit -27 degrees Celsius in January 1970, the graph went off the charts. The engineers at Mosenergo were terrified. They were looking at the newly built districts on the edge of the city, places like Belyayevo and Cheryomushki. These were the end of the pipe. The water had to travel through thousands of kilometers of steel to get there. The engineers knew that if the water cooled down too much before it reached those outer districts, it would turn to slush. It would freeze. The pipes would burst. The grid would be destroyed. To prevent a catastrophe at the edges of the empire, they had to nuke the core. They cranked the output temperatures to the absolute maximum design limits. They pushed the primary loop water to over 130 degrees Celsius and the secondary loop to over 95 degrees Celsius. They overheated the center of Moscow to save the suburbs. The result was that the inner and middle rings of the city, the vast residential belts built in the 1950s and 60s, were subjected to extreme, uncontrollable overheating. The defense against the cold became an assault of heat. This brings us to the sensory reality of the apartment. Step inside a standard Khrushchevka building in January 1970. The first thing you notice is the sound. The heating system is alive. The cast iron radiators are expanding under the immense thermal shifts of the scalding water. They emit a constant, unsettling soundtrack of clanking, banging, and metallic ticking. It's thermal expansion torture. The water is moving at such high velocity, driven by the district pumps fighting to maintain pressure, that it causes water hammer. A constant rushing sound, like wind blowing through a forest, emanates from the iron fins, filling the small living room with white noise. Then there is the smell. When water at 95 degrees Celsius hits a cast iron radiator that hasn't been dusted in a week, it creates a distinct olfactory phenomenon. The dust that has settled in the fins is instantly incinerated by the surface temperature. It creates an acrid, dry, metallic scent, the smell of burnt dust. It was the signature scent of the Moscow winter, a chemical signal that the air was being cooked. But the most dangerous element was invisible. It was the humidity, or rather, the lack of it. Heating cold outside air, which naturally holds very little moisture, without adding any humidity causes the relative humidity indoors to plummet. The optimal range for human health is 40% to 60%. Inside a Moscow apartment in January 1970, humidity levels dropped to single digits. We're talking about 10% to 15%. This is drier than the Sahara Desert. The air became a sponge. It sucked moisture out of everything. The parquet floors shrank and cracked, popping loudly in the middle of the night. Houseplants withered and died even if you watered them every day. And, most fatally, it sucked the moisture out of human beings. It dried out the mucous membranes of the nose and throat. This leads us to the central mystery and the defining image of the crisis, the fortochka. The fortochka is that small ventilation window built into the frame of every Soviet window. If you walked down Prof. Soyeznaya Street in the depths of that frieze, you would see a baffling sight. It is -30 degrees Celsius. The air is lethal, and yet thousands of these small windows are cracked open, venting clouds of steam into the frozen night.
This wasn't negligence, it was desperation. With no thermostats to turn down the scorching radiators, opening the window was the only way to regulate temperature. A family in a Series 2-18 tower faced a binary choice. You could swelter in 29 degrees Celsius dry heat, or you could open the vent and invite the negative 30 degrees Celsius air inside. Most people chose the latter. They created a chaotic thermal exchange. The heavy, freezing air would plunge into the room, colliding with the rising tropical heat. This created severe drafts and temperature stratification. Your feet were freezing in a draft while your head sweltered in dry heat. And this specific thermal collision, tropical dryness meeting Arctic drafts, created the perfect petri dish for the biological disaster that was about to unfold. Because while the citizens of Moscow were fighting the heat, something else had arrived in the city, a microscopic traveler from the east, and the heating system was about to give it a superpower. The 3,000 deaths that appeared in the excess mortality statistics for that winter were not simply victims of hypothermia found in snowbanks. The vast majority of them died in their beds, often sweating. They were casualties of a viral storm that the heating infrastructure had accidentally perfected. While the engineers at Mosenergo were obsessing over water pressure and turbine speeds, a biological agent was crossing the border. The winter of 1969-1970 marked the arrival of the second wave of the Hong Kong flu, H3N2. The first wave, in 1968, had been relatively mild in the Soviet Union. The authorities, confident in their socialized medicine, assumed the second wave would be the same. They were wrong. This version of the virus had undergone an antigenic shift. It was aggressive, it was fast, and it found a population with almost zero immunity. Usually, influenza spreads through heavy respiratory droplets. You cough, the droplets are heavy with moisture, they fall to the ground within a meter or two. Gravity does the work of containment. But inside the Soviet apartment of 1970, the laws of physics had changed. Because the heating system was running at maximum output to save the pipes, the indoor relative humidity had crashed to that critical 10 to 15% range. In this hyper-arid environment, something terrifying happens to a sneeze. The moisture in the droplet evaporates almost instantly, in a fraction of a second. The droplet doesn't fall, it shrinks. It becomes what epidemiologists call a droplet nucleus. These microscopic particles are so light that they don't obey gravity anymore. They obey air currents. And thanks to the scorching hot radiators creating powerful convection currents, hot air rising, cold air from the window falling, the air in the apartment was constantly churning. The virus wasn't just present, it was airborne and circulating. A single cough in the kitchen could keep infectious particles suspended in the living room for hours, drifting like invisible dust. The heating system had effectively weaponized the air. Meanwhile, on the streets, a different kind of tragedy was unfolding, one that the official newspapers like Pravda would never report. In the freezing dawn light, the militia patrols began to find the zammershi, the frozen ones. Moscow has always had a complicated relationship with alcohol, but in the deep freeze of 1970, vodka became a lethal paradox. As temperatures dropped below negative 25 degrees Celsius, consumption spiked. It was the traditional Russian remedy, the warming agent. But physiologically, alcohol is a vasodilator. It forces blood to the surface of the skin. It gives you a rush of warmth, a flushed face, a sense of safety. But it is a lie. That heat is leaving your core. You are believing thermal energy into the atmosphere at an accelerated rate. Men would leave work or a social gathering, stumbling home with a bottle in their stomach. They would feel warm. They would sit down on a bench near a bus stop or in an unheated entryway to rest for just a minute. The alcohol induced a slumber from which they never woke. The cold didn't care about their politics or their job at the factory. It simply took them. The sheer brutality of the weather warped the logistics of daily survival for everyone else. The food supply chain, already fragile under the stagnation of the Brezhnev era, began to fracture. Potatoes transported in unheated trucks froze solid.
When they thawed, the starch converted to sugar, turning them into a mushy, sickeningly sweet paste. Milk arrived at grocery stores not in bottles, but as blocks of ice that had to be chipped apart. Standing in line for bread became a physical endurance test. You had to wear Valenki, felt boots. Leather was useless. At minus 28 degrees Celsius, cheap Soviet leather froze stiff and cracked, offering no insulation. You watched your neighbors huddled in lines, faces wrapped in wool, eyes tearing up from the cold, the tears freezing on their eyelashes. But the real horror was reserved for the vulnerable inside the safety of the concrete box. Let's look at a specific hypothetical case that medical historians describe as typical for this period. Let's call her Elena. She's 72 years old, living in a 9th-floor apartment in a Series EI-18 tower in the Cheryomushki district.
Elena contracts the H3N2 virus. Her fever spikes to 39 degrees Celsius. Her body is burning up. The radiator next to her bed is radiating heat at 90 degrees Celsius, and there is no valve to turn it off. The room is sweltering, 28 degrees Celsius or higher. The air is dry as a bone. Her daughter, trying to help, does the only thing she can do. She opens the fortochka. A blast of negative 30 degrees Celsius air cuts through the room. It feels refreshing at first, but this thermal shock creates the second phase of the disaster. The human respiratory tract is lined with cilia, microscopic hairs that constantly beat in rhythm to sweep mucus and trapped pathogens out of the lungs. It is your primary defense against pneumonia. But in the 10% humidity of the apartment, Elena's mucus layer dehydrates. The cilia stop beating. They are paralyzed by the dryness. The defense mechanism is shut down. Then comes the draft from the window. The cold air irritates the already inflamed tissue. The mucus, now thick and stagnant, begins to accumulate in the lower lungs. It becomes a breeding ground for bacteria.
Elena doesn't die from the flu. She dies because her lungs, dried out by the state's heating system and shocked by the ventilation, succumb to secondary bacterial pneumonia. And here is where the system truly failed her. When her breathing becomes shallow, her daughter calls the ambulance. But the ambulance is delayed. The roads are sheets of ice. The diesel engines are struggling. The sheer volume of calls from heart attacks and slips has overwhelmed the dispatchers. When Elena finally reaches the hospital, she enters a facility that is suffering from the exact same engineering flaw as her apartment. The hospital is overheated. The hospital air is dry. There are no humidifiers because the Central Planning Committee didn't deem them essential equipment for general wards. The very place designed to cure her is maintaining the exact environmental conditions that are killing her. The killing colds was a misnomer. The cold was just the trigger. The weapon was the architecture itself.
But there was another layer to this disaster, one that wouldn't be understood until decades later. As the heating plants burned millions of tons of mazout to keep the water boiling, they were pumping something else into the city's atmosphere. The thermal inversion layer that trapped the cold air also trapped the pollution. Mosenergo's massive chimneys were belching sulfur dioxide and particulate matter directly into the stagnant air mass sitting over the city. With no wind to disperse it, the smog concentration skyrocketed. People were opening their windows to escape the heat and breathing in a cocktail of freezing air and industrial exhaust. The burnt dust smell inside the apartment was mirrored by a sulfurous, heavy smog outside. It was a dual-front war on the lungs of the Muscovite. And just when you think you understand the scale of the failure, you discover the most absurd detail of all. While thousands were dying of pneumonia in overheated apartments, there were entire buildings in the center of Moscow that were freezing. Not because the heat wasn't on, but because of how it was on. The engineers had pumped the pressure so high in the primary mains to force water to the suburbs that they destabilized the hydraulic balance of the inner city. In the older buildings near the garden ring, the pressure differential, the force that pushes water through the radiators, actually collapsed in some sectors. The water was screaming past their buildings in the main pipes so fast that it created a suction effect, pulling heat out of the local loops. It was a hydrodynamic nightmare. The harder they tried to heat the edges, the more they starved specific pockets of the center. You had a situation where one building was sweltering at 30 degrees Celsius with windows open, and the building across the street was freezing at 10 degrees Celsius with residents wearing fur coats in the kitchen. And the engineers knew it. They sat in the dispatch centers, watching the pressure gauges flutter, knowing that they had lost control of the hydraulic machine. They were flying the world's largest heating system blind, with no way to balance the load, praying for the anticyclone to break. But the anticyclone didn't move, and as the weeks dragged on, the infrastructure began to do something that terrified the party leadership even more than the death toll. It began to sing. The sound wasn't a melody, it was a warning scream from the infrastructure itself. By the third week of January, the hydraulic system of Moscow began to vibrate. Residents in the panel buildings described it as a low-frequency hum that you felt in your teeth before you heard it with your ears. This was the physical manifestation of the engineers' desperation. In their attempt to push superheated water to the freezing outskirts, they had increased the flow velocity in the primary mains to levels that defied safety protocols. The water was moving so fast through the 1,400-millimeter arterial pipes that it created turbulence violent enough to shake the ground. Beneath the frozen asphalt of Kalinin Prospekt, the steel pipes were shuddering. Inside the Mosenergo control rooms, the situation was shifting from crisis management to potential catastrophe. The engineers were staring at a terrifying reality. The return temperature was too high. Because the flow rate was constant, the rigid qualitative regulation method, and the radiators in the city center were so hot, the water coming back to the power plants was still scalding. This sounds like a good thing, right? It wasn't. It meant the massive T250 turbines at CHP-12 and CHP-21 couldn't cool down. The entire thermal cycle relies on a temperature drop. If the water comes back hot, you can't efficiently condense the steam driving the turbines. The efficiency plummeted. The plants were burning mountains of mazout just to keep the system stable, risking a thermal trip that would shut down the turbines entirely. If the turbines tripped, the pumps would stop. If the pumps stopped in minus 30 degrees Celsius weather, the water in the 16,000-kilometer network would stop moving, and then the clock would start. They would have perhaps 4 to 6 hours before the stationary water turned to ice. Once it froze, it would expand, bursting the pipes underground. The city would effectively be destroyed. Moscow would have become uninhabitable within 24 hours. The capital of the Soviet Union was balancing on a razor's edge between too hot and dead. While the engineers fought to prevent the apocalypse in the control rooms, the architecture itself began to fail the people. The first industrial generation buildings, the Khrushchevkas, Series K7, and the early towers, Series II-18, were revealing a fatal structural flaw that had been hidden by milder winters. These buildings were constructed from prefabricated concrete panels. The joints between these panels were sealed with cement and crude insulation. But in the deep freeze of 1970, the thermal stress shattered these seals. The outer walls of the buildings were freezing, contracting in the negative 28 degrees Celsius air. The inner walls were expanding from the plus 28 degrees Celsius radiators. This 56-degree differential created immense physical tension. The concrete panels literally pulled apart. Microcracks opened in the joints. The cold bridges formed. Residents reported a phenomenon that seemed impossible: frost growing on the inside of their wallpaper right next to a radiator that was burning hot. You could stand in your living room and burn your hand on the metal pipe while watching ice crystals form on the wall 3 feet away. This destroyed the thermal envelope of the home. The humidifiers that people improvised, wet towels on radiators, pots of boiling water, were useless. The dry heat instantly evaporated the water, and the drafts sucked the moisture out through the cracks in the walls. The apartment wasn't just a box, it was a wind tunnel. This leads us to the fortochka dilemma in its most tragic form. We talked about opening the window to cool down, but for many, the window became the enemy. In the older wooden frame windows, the condensation from the kitchen would drip down into the frame and freeze. The ice would expand, jamming the window shut. Then the wood would warp from the dryness. The window frames twisted, gaps opened up. People tried to seal them with anything they had, strips of newspaper soaked in soapy water, a traditional Soviet insulation method, cotton wool, even rags. But the dry air caused the paste to crumble and the paper to peel off. The cold was relentless. It found every gap. And here is what they didn't tell you in the history books. The Soviet government knew the heating system was killing people with dryness, but they were chemically powerless to stop it. The water circulating in the radiators wasn't just water, it was treated industrial water, deoxygenated and alkaline to prevent corrosion in the pipes. It was never meant to be exposed to the air. But in the chaos of 1970, the internal building systems began to leak. The rubber gaskets in the cast iron radiators, baked brittle by the 95 degrees Celsius heat, failed.
Pinprick leaks sprayed superheated, chemically treated water into the dry air of the apartments. This didn't humidify the room, it poisoned it. The water flashed into steam, carrying with it trace chemicals and rust particles. The burnt dust smell was joined by a metallic chemical tang. Residents were breathing a suspension of industrial rust and aerosolized radiator fluid. This brings us to the most jarring contradiction of the era. Turn on the television in January 1970, and you would see newsreels of the nuclear icebreaker Lenin crushing through the Arctic ice, a symbol of Soviet mastery over the cold. You would see reports on the glorious expansion of the Mosenergo grid. But in the privacy of the kitchen, the reality was a reversion to the primitive. In the ultra-modern districts of the Southwest, families were sleeping in fur coats and Valenki boots, not because it was cold, but because the drafts were so severe they cut through blankets. They were huddled around the gas stove in the kitchen, not for heat, but because the combustion of natural gas releases water vapor. The kitchen stove was the only humidifier they had.
It was a dark absurdity. The largest centralized heating system in human history was pumping gigacalories of heat into the building, yet the only way to make the air breathable was to burn a stove burner and risk carbon monoxide poisoning. Then the turning point arrived. It wasn't a sudden break, but a realization that percolated through the medical community. The hospitals were filling up with pneumonia cases, but the demographic was wrong. It wasn't just the elderly, it was healthy adults. It was children. Doctors began to notice that patients admitted for broken legs or appendicitis were developing respiratory infections inside the hospital. The hospital wards, heated by the same merciless grid, were incubators. The system was amplifying the epidemic. The realization was horrifying. There was no safe zone. The infrastructure that connected every building meant that every building shared the same fatal flaw. You couldn't escape the dry air because it was mandated by the Ministry of Power. And then, the biggest shock of the winter happened. A secret that remained buried in the engineering logs of the local housing administrations, GECs.
In late January, as the cold persisted, the ground shear stress snapped the cast iron water mains in several districts. Not the heating pipes, the cold water pipes. These pipes were buried above the heating mains to benefit from their warmth, but the frost line had gone too deep. When these pipes burst, they didn't just flood the streets. The water leaked into the subterranean heating channels. It hit the superheated steam pipes of the primary main. The reaction was explosive. The water flashed to steam instantly, blowing manhole covers into the air like mortars. But worse, this groundwater flooded the basements of the residential towers. In a normal summer, a flooded basement is a nuisance. In January 1970, it created a sauna from hell. The basement filled with boiling water from the thermal contact. The steam rose up through the ventilation shafts and the garbage chutes. The first floor apartments suddenly went from 10% humidity to 100% humidity in minutes. Wallpaper peeled off the walls in sheets, plaster dissolved.
The tropical paradox reached its zenith. Residents on the first floor were living in a steam bath, mold blooming instantly on the walls, while residents on the top floor were still desiccating in the arid heat. The building itself was becoming a biological weapon, rotting from the bottom up while drying out from the top down. And the engineers couldn't shut off the water to fix the leak, because if they stopped the flow for the repair, the heating mains would freeze. They had to let the basements boil. They chose to sacrifice the hygiene and structure of the buildings to save the grid. And that decision, made in the panic of 1970, is what brings us to the true horror of this story. The damage done to the concrete and steel in those few weeks didn't disappear when the snow melted.
This was the unraveling of the Soviet promise. By February, the crisis had evolved into a surreal domestic war zone where the laws of nature seemed to glitch. Inside the apartments, the dryness reached such extreme levels that static electricity became a physical hazard. Residents from that winter recall that you couldn't touch a door handle, a metal pot, or even another person without receiving a painful, visible spark. The air was so charged that synthetic clothing, which was becoming popular in the Soviet Union, would cling to the body and crackle with blue light in the dark. Pet cats became walking capacitors. To pet them was to shock them. It sounds trivial, but imagine living in a home where every metal surface bites you. It was a constant stinging reminder that the environment was unnatural. To combat this, Muscovites engaged in a mass improvisation of engineering. They turned their apartments into humidifiers. Families would take their coarsest bed sheets, soak them in water, and hang them over the scorching radiators. In a normal climate, a wet sheet takes hours to dry. In the 10% humidity of a Series 218 tower, the sheets would be bone dry in 20 minutes. The air simply devoured the water.
People placed buckets of water in the corners of rooms, only to find the water level dropping inches overnight as if there were a leak. There was no leak. The air was thirsty. The furniture began to self-destruct. The glues used in Soviet plywood furniture dried out and crystallized, causing chairs to wobble and fall apart. The parquet floors, the pride of the Stalin-era apartments, shrank so violently that gaps wide enough to lose a coin in opened between the slats. The city was literally cracking open from the inside. But the most damning aspect of the unraveling was the silence of the state. The newspapers were full of heroic reports about the natural gas deliveries and the resilience of the power grid. They did not report on the zamershi, the frozen ones. The deaths on the street were handled with a bureaucratic efficiency that bordered on the dystopian. When a militia patrol found a body in a snowbank or a drunk who had collapsed in an unheated vestibule, the death was rarely recorded as hypothermia. That would imply a failure of the system to protect the citizen. Instead, the death certificates were filled with heart failure, cardiac arrest, or simply accident. The statistics were sanitized. The killing cold was administratively erased, turning a mass casualty event into a series of unrelated individual misfortunes.
Meanwhile, the Mosenergo engineers were trapped in the quality regulation trap. This is the mechanism that made the tragedy inevitable. Remember, the system controlled heat by temperature, not flow. This meant that to keep the farthest building in the district of Belyevo from freezing, the power plant had to send water that was lethally hot to the buildings closer to the plant, like those in the Gagarin district. It was a geographic lottery. If you lived near the heat source, you were boiled. If you lived at the end of the line, you shivered. The hydraulic imbalance was so severe that in some end-of-pipe buildings, the water arrived not just cool, but with almost zero pressure. Residents on the top floors of these peripheral buildings opened their taps and got nothing. The water didn't have the strength to climb the riser. They were left with no heat and no water, while 5 kilometers away, their fellow citizens were venting steam out the window.
This inequality bred a dark, quiet resentment. The Soviet citizen was used to shortages, but this was a shortage caused by excess. It highlighted the rigid stupidity of the central planning model. A
A simple thermostat valve on the radiator, a piece of technology that had existed for decades in the West, could have solved the entire crisis. It would have allowed the boiled residents to turn down the heat, saving energy and pressure for the frozen residents. But the Soviet industrial machine couldn't produce millions of individual valves. It could build the world's largest turbines, but it couldn't manufacture the small, intricate brass fittings needed for individual control. The ideology favored the macro over the micro. The state controlled the flow. The individual had no agency. As the second wave of the Hong Kong flu peaked in late January, this lack of agency became fatal. The hospitals were now scenes of chaotic triage. The pneumonia feedback loop was in full effect. Patients admitted for the flu developed secondary bacterial infections because their airways were parched. The mortality rate for admitted pneumonia cases spiked. And here is the grim irony. The doctors knew. The medical staff in Moscow's hospitals were well educated. They understood the link between dry air and respiratory failure. But they couldn't turn down the heat in the wards either. They were subject to the same grid, the same pipes, the same rigidity. They were fighting a viral fire while the building itself was pouring gasoline on it. The crisis also unraveled the myth of the invincible Soviet infrastructure. The pipes that survived the winter of 1970 did not emerge unscathed. The extreme thermal cycling, the expansion from the heat and the contraction from the ground frost, caused microscopic fatigue in the steel. The insulation around the pipes, often made of glass wool and simple waterproofing, was pulverized by the ground movement. We are looking at the origin story of the Soviet ghost. The infrastructure that is collapsing in modern Russia today, the pipes bursting in Podolsk and Novosibirsk in 2024, received their first mortal wounds in 1970. The corrosion started then. The metal thinned. The system was pushed past its yield point and never truly repaired, only patched.
By the time the anticyclone finally dissipated in February and the westerlies returned, bringing snow and relief, the damage was done. The death toll was never officially tabulated. The 3,000 figure is a reconstruction based on excess mortality data, a statistical ghost of the people who didn't have to die. The city thawed. The zamershi were buried. The parquet floors were patched, the wet sheets were put back on the beds, and the system went back to normal operation. Mosenergo was awarded commendations for maintaining the grid during the historic freeze. The engineers were given medals for keeping the turbines spinning. The disaster was reframed as a victory. But the lesson of 1970 remained unlearned. The refusal to integrate feedback, the refusal to give the end user control, the obsession with centralized scale over individual safety, these weren't just glitches, they were features of the system. And they set a ticking clock that would take 50 years to run out. Now, we must look at the legacy of this winter, because the pipes that boiled grandmothers in 1970 are the same pipes that are freezing their grandchildren today. The killing cold didn't go away. It just waited. The forensic investigation of the Moscow winter of 1970 reveals a catastrophe of unintended consequences that echoes directly into the present day. The killing cold was a misnomer. The true killer wasn't the Siberian Anticyclone, it was the rigidity of the response to it. It was the dry air that paralyzed the lungs. It was the viral storm that exploited that paralysis. It was the architecture that offered no middle ground between freezing to death and sweltering in a tropical incubator. The 3,000 excess deaths of that winter stand as a grim monument to the limitations of technocratic control. They were the collateral damage of a system that could heat a city of millions, but could not care for a single shivering grandmother. But the story doesn't end in 1970.
It is merely the prologue to the infrastructure collapse we are witnessing right now. Fast forward 54 years. It is January 2024. The location is Podolsk, a mere 30 kilometers from the Moscow apartments we've been discussing. The weather is once again brutally cold, hovering near minus 25 degrees Celsius. But this time, the tragedy is the inverse of 1970. In 1970, the system killed with excess. In 2024, it killed with absence. In Podolsk, a massive heating main burst, leaving 150,000 people without heat in the dead of winter. This event was born of the exact same structural flaw, centralized rigidity. The pipes that burst in Podolsk were the direct descendants of the Soviet expansion. The infrastructure laid during the rapid growth of the 1960s and 70s was designed with a lifespan of 25 to 30 years. It is now entering its fifth or sixth decade of service. This is the Soviet ghost that modern analysts warn about. The pipes have thinned from corrosion. The insulation has rotted away. The system that was overheated in 1970 to save the periphery is now simply breaking apart. When one massive pipe fails in a centralized network like Mosenergo's, it doesn't affect a single building, it affects entire districts. The heat riots of 2024 are the loud, angry children of the silent suffering of 1970. In 1970, people opened their windows to vent the steam. In 2024, residents in towns like Elektrostal were filmed burning fires in the streets to keep warm. These images are a haunting echo of the Zamorzhyi of 1970, a testament to a system that has fundamentally failed to prioritize the safety of the individual over the scale of the state. The lesson of 1970 was simple. Centralized power without feedback leads to disaster. The Soviet engineers created a machine of immense power, the hydraulic monolith, but they forgot to build a way for the machine to listen. They treated the city as a single organism, assuming that if the average temperature was correct, the people were safe. But people don't live in averages. They live in specific apartments with specific lungs and specific vulnerabilities. The Mosenergo system operated on the philosophy that heat is life, but by pumping that heat without control, without thermostats, and without regard for the biological reality of the human respiratory system, they turned the heat into a weapon. They created a thermal paradox where the defense against the cold became as lethal as the cold itself. The legacy of those 3,000 deaths is written in the rusting steel buried beneath the streets of Moscow. The system never fundamentally changed. It just got older. The quality regulation method is still the standard. The lack of individual thermostats in older buildings is still a reality. The burnt dust smell still heralds the arrival of winter for millions of people. The tragedy of the Volkov family, of Elena and her high-rise, of the drunk men frozen on the benches, is that their deaths were preventable. They didn't die because the technology didn't exist to save them. They died because the ideology of the state couldn't accommodate the nuance of individual comfort. They were statistically insignificant errors in a graph that showed a successful heating season. So the next time you see a picture of a Soviet apartment block in winter, with the snow piled high and the windows glowing with warm yellow light, look closer. Look for the fortochka. Look for that small, open square of glass venting steam into the night. It isn't a sign of cozy warmth. It is a sign of a desperate battle for survival. It is the exhaust port of a machine that is running too hot, fueled by an empire that tried to conquer nature and, in the process, declared war on its own people. The cold never sleeps, and as the pipes of the Soviet Union continue to age, the ghost of 1970 is waking up.